In the unforgiving dust of the American West, a woman's worth was often measured by the narrowness of her waist and the delicateness of her hands. For Tessa Worthington, a hopeful bride journeying from the cobbled streets of Boston, that measurement would become a public sentence. She arrived in the raw frontier town of Redemption Gulch with a heart full of dreams, only to have them shattered on the train platform by the very man who had promised her a new life. He rejected her for her size, for the strong, sturdy frame that carried her across a continent. Cast out and humiliated, her story should have ended there. But in the shadows of the towering pines, a different kind of man was watching a lumberjack who didn't see a flaw, but a fortress. He saw the strength the world had scorned and knew he had found his perfect match. This is the story of a rejection that led to a redemption no one saw coming. The hiss of the steam engine was a final mournful sigh as the train ground to a halt. For 3 weeks, this sound had been the rhythm of Tessa Worthington's life, a percussive beat marking the miles that separated her from everything she had ever known. She pressed a hand to the grimy window, her heart a frantic bird against her ribs. Outside, under the bleached white Montana sky, was Redemption Gulch. It wasn't much more than a single wide, muddy street, flanked by raw timber buildings, a testament to grit rather than grace. But to Tessa, it was the promised land. It was the future. Her hands, though gloved, felt clammy. In her reticule was the photograph he had sent, a stern-looking man with a neatly trimmed mustache and a high collar. Mr. Alistair Finch, a purveyor of fine goods, his letter had stated. He sought a wife to share in his prosperity, a woman of good character and a steady temperament. His words were precise, elegant, a stark contrast to the rugged penmanship of other suitors she had considered. He had enclosed the train fare and a promise of a life of comfort and respectability. Tessa smoothed the front of her traveling dress, a deep blue wool that had felt fashionable in Boston, but now seemed heavy and suffocating. She knew she was not a delicate flower. The Worthingtons were built of sturdy stock, a lineage of shipbuilders and merchants' wives who faced Atlantic gales, not prairie dust. Tessa had inherited her father's broad shoulders and a height that made her tower over most women. She was strong, capable, with hands that could knead bread for 20 or mend a sail with equal skill. Her letters to Mr. Finch had been honest about her practical nature, her desire for a true partnership. She had, however, omitted a precise description of her person, praying that her good character and steady temperament would be enough. Taking a deep breath, she stepped from the train car, her sturdy boots sinking slightly into the platform's dusty planks. The air was thin and smelled of pine dust and something vaguely metallic. A small crowd had gathered, a mix of curious townsfolk, grizzled miners, and women in calico dresses, their faces etched with the hardships of frontier life. And then she saw him. He was just as his photograph depicted, only smaller in stature than she had imagined. Mr. Alistair Finch stood apart from the others, a pristine black suit, amidst a sea of denim and homespun cotton. He held a small, perfect bouquet of prairie wildflowers, and his eyes scanned the disembarking passengers with an air of impatient ownership. Tessa's heart gave a hopeful leap. She raised a hand, a smile blooming on her face, a smile that had been practiced and saved for this very moment. "Mr. Finch," she called out, her voice richer and deeper than the tinkling tones he was likely accustomed to. His head snapped in her direction. His eyes, small and dark, swept over her. They started at her face, then traveled down her broad shoulders, her ample bosom, the solid column of her waist and hips, and finally to her sensible boots. The journey took but a second, but in that second, Tessa watched a universe of hope collapse. The polite anticipation on his face curdled, replaced by a mask of disbelief, then horror, and finally a sneer of pure, unadulterated disgust. He took an involuntary step back. The perfect little bouquet of wildflowers slipped from his grasp, scattering at his feet. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Tessa felt 100 pairs of eyes on her, their gazes no longer curious. but sharp and judgmental. The heat rising in her cheeks had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. It was the fire of profound public shame. You are Miss Worthington." Alistair Finch finally stammered his voice, carrying in the sudden silence. He did not step forward. He made her close the remaining distance, each step a walk of condemnation. "I am," she said, forcing her chin up. "It is a pleasure to finally meet you, Mr. Finch." He let out a short, incredulous laugh. It was a cruel, sharp sound that cut her deeper than end of a knife. "A pleasure, madame. There has been a grievous error." He gestured vaguely at her, his hand waving as if to dismiss a piece of oversized, unwanted luggage. "I advertised for a wife, a companion, not a workhorse." The crowd tittered. A woman in a garish purple hat, who Tessa would later come to know as Beatrice Hemlock, the banker's wife, let out a particularly loud, piercing giggle. Tessa's blood ran cold. The strength that had seen her through a lonely childhood and the grief of losing her parents threatened to abandon her. "Sir," she began, her voice trembling despite her efforts to keep it steady, "my letters were truthful. I am a woman of good character. Your letters were a deception." He spat, his face flushing a blotchy red. "You painted a picture of a demure, respectable woman. You are colossal. An Amazon. What would I do with you? Have you mend the roof? Frighten the horses?" The laughter grew louder, crueler. Tessa felt her entire world shrinking to this single dusty platform, to this one man's venomous words. She was no longer a person. She was a spectacle. The mail order mistake. "I am a strong woman, Mr. Finch," she said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "There is more to a wife than the circumference of her waist." "Not for me, there isn't," he retorted, turning to the crowd as if seeking their validation. "A man in my position, a respected merchant, requires a wife who is a credit to him, a delicate ornament for his home. You, madam, would shatter the furniture." His final words landed like a physical blow. The humiliation was complete, a thick, suffocating blanket. She had traveled over 2,000 miles, spent every last cent she had on a new dress and a trunk of hopeful belongings, all for this, to be publicly dismantled piece by piece by a small man with an even smaller soul. He turned his back on her, then addressing the station master. "See that this person's trunk is removed. She will not be coming with me." Without another glance in her direction, Alistair Finch strode away, melting back into the crowd that now openly gawked and whispered. Tessa stood frozen. The steam from the departing train billowed around her, clinging to her like a shroud. She was alone, utterly and completely alone, in a town that had condemned her on sight. Her trunk containing all her worldly possessions was unceremoniously dumped onto the platform beside her with a heavy thud. It sounded like a coffin lid slamming shut. The future she had so carefully constructed had just been burned to the ground, and she was left standing in the ashes with the laughter of strangers as her only welcome. From the shade of the livery stable across the street, a man watched the entire sordid affair. He wasn't laughing. Holden Fairfax, his hands calloused from the axe, and saw his shoulders wide enough to block the sun, leaned against a post, his jaw tight with a quiet fury. He had seen Alistair Finch preen and boast for weeks about the delicate rose he was importing from the East, and he had just watched that same man crush a woman who from this distance looked not like a workhorse, but like a sturdy, magnificent oak tree in a world of brittle weeds. He saw the proud, defiant tilt of her chin, even as her world crumbled, and in that moment, the lumberjack felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a very long time, a protective, righteous anger. The town of Redemption Gulch had made its judgment, but Holden Fairfax was just beginning to make his. The laughter eventually subsided, replaced by the mundane sounds of the town, the clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the whinny of a horse, the distant rumble of a wagon. The crowd dispersed, having gotten their fill of the day's entertainment, leaving Tessa alone on the platform with her shame and her heavy trunk. The sun beat down, and the grand blue sky that had seemed so promising an hour ago now felt like a vast empty canvas mocking her desolation. Panic, cold and sharp, began to set in. Her return fare was in Mr. Finch's pocket. Her savings were gone. To go back east was impossible. To stay seemed equally so. She was a pariah before she had even set foot on the town's main street. Every door she imagined was already closed to her. A long shadow fell over her. Tessa looked up expecting more scorn and saw an older woman with a face as weathered as old leather, her gray hair pulled into a tight, no-nonsense bun. Her eyes, however, were surprisingly kind. "That was a low-down, dirty shame," the woman said, her voice raspy but firm. "Alistair Finch has all the spine of a jellyfish." She looked Tessa up and down, but her gaze was practical, not judgmental. "You got a place to go?" Tessa shook her head, the lump in her throat making it impossible to speak. "Name's Martha Gable," the woman said. "I run the boarding house at the end of the street. The respectable one," she added with a wry twist of her lips. "It ain't the Grand Hotel, but the roof don't leak. And the beds are clean. I got an empty room. Could use a hand in the kitchen, too, if you ain't too proud to work for your keep." Relief so potent, it almost brought Tessa to her knees, washed over her. She finally found her voice. "I'm not proud, ma'am. I'm grateful." She swallowed hard. "My name is Tessa Worthington." "I know who you are, child. The whole town does by now," Martha said, not unkindly. "Don't you mind them. Their memories are short, and their minds are narrow. Now let's get this trunk of yours moved before it bakes to the platform." Martha's boarding house was a plain two-story building, but as promised, it was clean. The air inside smelled of beeswax and roasting chicken. It was a scent of order and domesticity that grounded Tessa a small anchor in her churning sea of despair. Her room was small, with a simple iron bedstead, a washstand, and a single window overlooking a dusty alley, but to Tessa it was a sanctuary. The work was hard, but Tessa welcomed it. She rose before dawn to stoke the kitchen stove, kneaded massive troughs of dough for the day's bread-scrubbed floors until her knuckles were raw, and washed mountains of laundry in a steaming cauldron out back. The physical exertion was a balm, a way to channel her grief and humiliation into something productive. It left her too tired at night to dwell on Alistair Finch's cruel words, or the whispers that still followed her when she had to run an errand in town. Her boarders were a motley crew of miners, a traveling preacher, and a few ranch hands. They were mostly gruff, exhausted men who cared more about the quantity of food on their plate than the size of the woman serving it. They were polite enough, but distant. She was still the rejected bride, a walking cautionary tale. It was during the evening meal a week into her new life that she truly noticed him. He wasn't a boarder, but he took his supper at Martha's table most nights. He was the large man she had vaguely registered at the livery stable on that first terrible day. Holden Fairfax. He was a giant of a man with shoulders that seemed to strain the very fabric of his flannel shirt. His hair was a dark, unruly thatch, and his beard, while thick, was neatly trimmed. But it was his hands that always caught her attention. They were huge and calloused, crisscrossed with the white scars of a life spent battling timber, yet they moved with a surprising gentleness as he handled his fork and knife. He rarely spoke, his presence a quiet, solid mass at the end of the long table, while other men might stare at her, their eyes lingering with pity or a crude curiosity. Holden Fairfax's gaze was different. He didn't stare at her. He seemed to see her. He saw her effortlessly hoist a heavy pot of stew that made Martha grunt with effort. He saw her calm a spooked horse in the alley with a low, soothing word. He saw the determined set of her jaw as she ignored a catcall from a passing drunk. One evening, Beatrice Hemlock and her friend, another town gossip named Penelope Pringle, entered the boarding-house dining room. It was not their usual haunt, and it was clear they had come only to inspect the creature in its new habitat. "Well, well, Martha," Beatrice said in her high, carrying voice, loud enough for the entire room to hear. "I see you've taken in a charity case. How benevolent of you." Tessa, who was refilling water glasses, felt her back stiffen. She kept her eyes down her face, burning. "She earns her keep, Beatrice," Martha retorted sharply, "which is more than can be said for some." "Oh, I'm sure she earns it," Penelope tittered. "A woman of her proportions must be very strong. Perhaps you could hire her out to help with the logging." The few men who snickered fell silent at the sound of a chair scraping loudly against the wooden floor. Holden Fairfax rose slowly to his full, intimidating height. He didn't look at the women. He fixed his gaze on Tessa, his expression unreadable, but for the intensity in his dark eyes. "Miss Worthington," he said, his voice a low rumble like distant thunder. "You missed a spot." Tessa looked up confused. He nodded toward his own empty water glass. It was a simple, mundane request, but the timing, the tone, the sheer force of his presence transformed it. He was giving her a task, a reason to be there, a shield of normalcy against their barbs. He was refusing to participate in their spectacle, and in doing so, he invalidated it. Beatrice and Penelope, flustered by the giant lumberjack's silent rebuke, muttered something about the uncouth company, and swept out of the room. Tessa moved to his side and filled his glass, her hand trembling slightly. "Thank you," she whispered so low, only he could hear. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, his eyes meeting hers for a brief, powerful moment. In their depths, she saw not pity, but respect. It was a look that valued her substance, not her surface. That night, as Tessa lay in her small bed, the memory of that look was a spark in the darkness. It was a fragile flickering thing, but for the first time since arriving in Redemption Gulch, it felt like hope. The whispers and the scorn still echoed in the corners of her mind, but now there was a new sound, a deep, quiet rumble that promised something different. It promised that one person in this town did not see her as a mistake. And for now, that was enough. The encounter with Beatrice Hemlock marked a subtle shift. The whispers didn't vanish, but they seemed to lose some of their power over Tessa. Holden Fairfax's quiet defense had forged a small protective space around her. His gesture was not lost on the other men at the supper table either. A lumberjack of his, standing the head of the most successful logging camp in the region, commanded a silent respect that outmuscled even the banker's wife's social standing. Holden began to break his customary silence. It started with simple things. "That was good stew, Miss Worthington," he'd rumble as he left the dining room, or if he saw her struggling to carry a heavy load of firewood. "Allow me." He would take the wood from her, his large hands brushing against hers, sending a jolt of unexpected warmth through her. He never made it seem as though he thought she was weak. His assistance felt more like a shared effort, a quiet acknowledgement of a fellow strong soul. He started bringing her things. They were never flashy or store-bought. One day, it was a perfectly formed pine cone, its scales opened like a wooden rose. Another time, it was a cluster of tiny, resilient purple flowers he'd found growing defiantly from a rock face high up in the mountains. He would leave them on the kitchen windowsill, never presenting them directly, as if he were too shy to make a formal offering. But Tessa knew they were for her. They were pieces of his world, the silent, majestic world of the forest, and he was sharing them with her. Tessa found herself looking forward to evenings. She would take extra care with the meals. She knew he favored a rich beef and barley soup or a hearty apple crumble. She began to see past his intimidating size to the quiet thoughtfulness within. She learned to read the subtle shifts in his expression, the slight crinkle at the corners of his eyes when one of Martha's stories amused him, the tightening of his jaw when he spoke of the dangers of his work. One Saturday afternoon, as Tessa was beating a rug in the alley behind the boarding house, sending clouds of dust into the air, Holden appeared. He wasn't in his work clothes, but in a clean shirt and trousers, his hair damp and combed. "Good afternoon, Miss Worthington," he said, his voice seeming to vibrate in the narrow space. "Mr. Fairfax," she replied, pausing, her heart giving a little flutter. "It's rare to see you in town on a Saturday." "The men get a half day," he explained. I had some business at the Mercantile." He seemed to be searching for words. "I was wondering, that is, I heard there's to be a town social tonight, a barn dance, to raise funds for the new schoolhouse." Tessa's heart sank. A town social. The very thought of it, of putting herself on display for the likes of Beatrice Hemlock and Alastair Finch, made her stomach clench. "I hadn't planned on attending," she said quietly. "I understand," he said, his gaze steady. "But I was thinking, the schoolhouse is a good cause, and the music is usually lively." He took a breath. "I would be honored, Miss Worthington, if you would allow me to escort you." The offer hung in the air between them, as real and tangible as the dust motes dancing in the sunlight. It was more than an invitation. It was a challenge to the town, a public declaration. He wasn't just asking her to a dance. He was asking to stand with her in front of everyone. Fear warred with a powerful surging hope. The fear told her to stay hidden to nurse her wounds in private. But the hope, kindled by his respect and fanned by his small kindnesses, urged her to be brave. She thought of the sturdy oak tree he saw, not the workhorse Finch had scorned. Oaks do not hide in the shadows. I would like that very much, Mr. Fairfax," she said, a genuine smile finally reaching her eyes. The change in him was remarkable. The tension left his shoulders, and a slow, wide smile spread across his face, transforming his rugged features. "Holden," he said. "My name is Holden." "Tessa," she replied softly. That evening, a nervous energy filled Martha's kitchen. Martha, who had overheard the invitation, was as excited as a mother hen. She insisted Tessa wear her own Sunday dress, a soft green calico that, with a few quick alterations, fit Tessa perfectly. It was a simple dress, but it brought out the color of her eyes and complemented her healthy, vibrant complexion. When Holden arrived at dusk, he was holding not a wildflower, but a small, slightly clumsy corsage of prairie roses, tied with a bit of twine. He looked at her, his dark eyes filled with an open, undisguised admiration that made her feel more beautiful than any fancy gown or compliment ever could. Walking into the lantern-lit barn on Holden's arm was one of the most terrifying things Tessa had ever done. A hush fell over the chattering crowd as they entered. She could feel the stares, hear the indrawn breaths. She saw Alastair Finch standing near the punch bowl, his face a mask of sour disbelief. She saw Beatrice Hemlock, her mouth a perfect O of shock. Tessa's hand tightened on Holden's arm. He leaned down, his voice for her ears alone. "Keep your eyes on me, Tessa. No one else matters." And she did. When the fiddler struck up a lively reel, Holden led her onto the dance floor. He was surprisingly light on his feet for such a big man, guiding her through the steps with a firm, confident hand. They were an odd couple, the towering lumberjack and the tall, sturdy woman. But as they moved together, something clicked into place. They fit. Their strides matched their strength, complemented each other. The whispers and stares faded into the background, drowned out by the music and the simple joy of the moment. They danced 3 dances in a row. By the third, a few other brave couples had joined them, and the ice was broken. Holden led her over to the refreshment table, his hand resting possessively on the small of her back. It was there that Alastair Finch chose to confront them. He had clearly had too much punch, and his face was slick with sweat. "Well, Fairfax," Finch sneered, his eyes flicking disdainfully over Tessa. "I see you found a use for my leftovers. Does she help you fell trees?" Before Tessa could even react, Holden stepped forward, placing himself between her and Finch. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The quiet menace that radiated from him was more potent than any shout. "You'll watch your mouth, Finch," Holden said, his voice a low growl. "You had your chance to appreciate a fine woman, and you proved you've got the sense and courage of a field mouse. You ever speak to her or about her like that again, and you'll find out just how quickly I can clear a patch of worthless scrub." Alistair Finch, for all his bluster, was a coward at heart. He paled, took one look at the sheer granite wall of Holden's chest, and scurried away without another word. Holden turned back to Tessa. He gently took her hand, his thumb stroking over her knuckles. "He's not worth the dust on your boots," he said. "Thank you, Holden." She whispered, her heart overflowing with an emotion she hadn't dared to name until now. It was a fierce, protective, and deeply tender feeling. It was love. He led her outside, away from the noise and the heat of the barn, into the cool moonlit night. The stars of the Montana sky were scattered like diamonds on black velvet. "Tessa," he began, his voice rough with emotion, "I'm not a man for fancy words. I live a simple life. It's hard and it's dangerous, but it's an honest one." He paused, turning to face her fully. "When I saw you on that platform, I didn't see what he saw. I saw strength. I saw a woman who had crossed a country on a promise, a woman who stood tall even when she was being torn down. I see it every day, in the way you work, the way you carry yourself. You're not an ornament, Tessa. You're the whole damn house. You're the foundation and the roof and everything in between." Tears welled in Tessa's eyes, but they were not tears of shame or sorrow. They were tears of joy. "My whole life," she said, her voice thick, "I felt like I was too much. Too tall, too strong, too big. You're the first person who has ever made me feel like I am just right. More than right," he said, his voice dropping to a husky whisper. "You're perfect." Slowly, gently, he lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a fiery, demanding kiss, but one of profound tenderness and respect. It was a kiss that sealed a promise under the vast, silent canopy of the western night. In that moment, Tessa knew she was home. Her journey had been longer and harder than she had ever imagined, but it had led her here, to this man, to this feeling of being utterly, completely, and perfectly cherished. The night of the barn dance was a turning point, a line drawn in the dusty soil of Redemption Gulch. Before it, Tessa and Holden had been two solitary figures orbiting the town's harsh judgment. After they were a constellation, the stares they received were no longer solely of scorn, but of a grudging, perplexed admiration. A woman who could not only capture, but hold the unwavering devotion of Holden Fairfax, a man as solid and respected as the mountains themselves, was a force to be reckoned with. The town's narrative had been forcibly rewritten. Their courtship bloomed in the quiet spaces the world left them. The changing season painted the landscape in hues of gold and amber, and their affection for one another deepened with each passing day. Holden would descend from his logging camp on Whisper Wind Ridge each Saturday, his arrival marking the true beginning of Tessa's week. Their time together was woven from simple, profound moments that felt more real than any poetry. He led her on walks that were more like pilgrimages deep into the woods that bordered the town. On one such afternoon, he guided her away from the worn path, his large hand gently on her back, to a hidden clearing where a lone ancient pine tree stood. Its bark was gnarled and scarred, a testament to lightning strikes and long winters, yet its upper branches reached for the sky with a vibrant, defiant green. "This is the old man," Holden said, his voice soft with reverence. "My father showed him to me when I was a boy. He told me that some things aren't valuable because they're easy to cut down, but because they've learned how to stand, because they've endured." He looked from the tree to her, and in his eyes she saw he was speaking of more than just timber. He was telling her what he valued. He was telling her what he saw in her. In return, Tessa shared her own world with him. In the evenings, after the boarders had retired, she would light a lamp in the quiet dining room and read to him from the leather-bound books she'd carried all the way from Boston. He would sit in a sturdy chair, his massive frame perfectly still, his calloused hands resting on his knees, and listen with an intensity that humbled her. He who could read the story of a forest in its soil and wind was captivated by her tales of stormy seas and distant kings. "It's a different kind of wilderness," he murmured once after she'd finished a chapter of a seafaring epic. "Just as vast, just as unforgiving." He looked at her, his gaze thoughtful. "You crossed a world to get here, Tessa. I just had to climb a mountain." It was in these moments that she knew their bond was more than just affection. It was a meeting of souls, a recognition of the shared resilience that lay beneath their very different surfaces. The quiet lumberjack and the rejected mail-order bride were building a life together, a sturdy shelter of mutual respect and burgeoning love. But the West was a land of brutal sudden changes, and their tranquil season of peace was not destined to last. The first tremor of the coming earthquake arrived as a rumor carried on the wind like a foul scent. A new logging outfit from Chicago, the Kane Timber Corporation, had muscled its way into the territory. Its owner, Jedediah Kane, was a man who moved with the rapacious speed of a predator, leaving behind a trail of broken contracts and depleted forests. He was everything Holden was not, a man who saw trees as mere commodities and people as tools or obstacles. At first the threat was distant. Then it came to Martha's dinner table. One of Holden's younger loggers, a boy named Billy, caught Holden after the evening meal, his hat twisting nervously in his hands. "Mr. Fairfax, sir," he stammered, avoiding Holden's steady gaze. I've come to give my notice. Mr. Kane's foreman offered me 20 cents more a day." Holden's expression didn't change, but Tessa saw the subtle tightening of his jaw. "Kane's money comes and goes, Billy. You know that. His camps are temporary. What he offers today, he'll take back tomorrow. I know, sir, but my wife, she's expecting." "I need the money now," the boy mumbled, his face a picture of misery. Holden simply nodded his disappointment, a palpable weight in the room. "I understand. I wish you well, Billy." He didn't argue or plead. He let the boy go, but Tessa felt the loss as if it were her own. Kane wasn't just attacking Holden's business. He was preying on the loyalties Holden had spent years building. 2 more men followed Billy within the week. Then came the sabotage. Holden was gone for 3 days, staying up on the ridge. He returned late one night, long after the boarding house was dark. Tessa heard his heavy, weary steps on the porch and went to meet him. The moment she saw his face in the moonlight, she knew something was terribly wrong. He was covered in grease and grime, and his eyes, usually so calm, were dark with a cold fury. "He's done it," Holden said, his voice a low, ragged growl. "He's finally done it. The steam donkey." Someone cracked the boiler and stripped the gears. "It's useless. It'll take a month to get parts from St. Louis, a month I don't have. The railroad contract is forfeit if I can't deliver." He sank onto the porch steps, the immense strength seeming to drain out of him. He looked defeated, and the sight of it broke Tessa's heart. Jedediah Kane had found his weak point, the fragile intersection of timelines and finances, and struck a devastating blow. Tessa sat beside him, not speaking, simply letting her presence be a silent anchor in his storm. She watched him run a hand over his face, the gesture conveying a depth of despair she had never seen in him. It was in that moment that she realized her role was not just to offer comfort. It was to fight alongside him. She was not the damsel cowering in the fortress. She was the fortress itself. "Holden," she said softly, waiting until he looked at her. "Let me help. There's nothing to be done," he said, his voice flat. "He's won." "No," she insisted, her tone hardening with resolve. You are a master of the forest of timber and steel. My father was a master of paper and ink. He built a shipping empire on contracts and clauses. He lost it all, but not before he taught me how to read the fine print. Let me see the contract you have with the railroad. Let me see the deed for your claim." He looked at her, a flicker of surprise in his exhausted eyes. "Tessa, it's a legal mess. Lawyers wrote it to confuse people." "Good," she replied, a grim smile touching her lips. "I've spent my life being underestimated. Let's see if your Mr. Kane has made the same mistake." The next day he brought her the papers from the banker's safe. That night, the dining room of the boarding house became a war room. With the house still and silent around her, Tessa spread the documents across the great oak table, a single kerosene lamp casting a pool of determined light. Page after page of dense legal jargon passed under her steady gaze. For hours, she read her finger, tracing each line, her mind sifting through the convoluted language. The clock on the mantel ticked away the precious hours. Her eyes grew gritty, and her back ached, but she refused to stop. She was searching for a shield, a weapon, a single word that could turn the tide. Just as the first hint of gray dawn touched the window panes, she found it. It wasn't in the main body of the railroad contract, but in the dusty, decades-old addendum to the original territorial land grant for Whisperwind Ridge. The language was archaic, almost forgotten. In the event of work stoppage due to acts of God nature or deliberate and malicious interference by a third party, the holder of this claim shall be granted a 60-day extension to fulfill all contractual obligations pending review and proof by a territorial agent. Her heart leaped. "Holden," she whispered, though he was asleep upstairs. She read it again, the words seeming to glow on the page. It was more than a loophole. It was a lifeline. Jedediah Kane, in his arrogance, had provided them with the very tool they needed to defeat him, time. But they needed proof. Later that morning, they rode up to the silent wounded logging camp. While Holden grimly assessed the full extent of the damage to his steam donkey, Tessa began her own investigation. She walked the area around the crippled machine, her eyes scanning the ground with the same meticulous attention she'd given the contracts. She was not a tracker, but she was a woman who noticed details. She saw the deep, confident prints of Holden's men, and then she saw another set, fainter, smaller, made by a more expensive town boot, with a distinctive star-shaped logo embossed on the heel. The saboteur had been careless. Her gaze continued to sweep the area, moving beyond the obvious. Near a pile of discarded rags, something glinted, catching the morning sun. She knelt, her fingers brushing away the dirt. It was a cigar holder. Not a simple pipe or a cheap cheroot, but a polished silver holder, intricately engraved. It was an object of vanity and wealth, the kind of ostentatious accessory a man like Jedediah Kane would carry. No logger on Holden's crew could afford such a luxury. She picked it up, its cold, metallic weight, feeling like victory in her palm. Armed with the resurrected claws and the damning physical evidence, they rode not to the local sheriff, but to the regional land office in Helena. Before a skeptical territorial agent, Tessa laid out their case. She didn't speak with emotion, but with the cool, irrefutable logic her father had taught her. She pointed to the claws in the grant, presented the cigar holder, and described the unique boot prints. The agent, a man accustomed to bluster and threats, was clearly impressed by her calm command of the facts. After a lengthy review, he stamped their papers. The 60-day extension was granted. Word of their victory traveled fast. Jedediah Kane, publicly thwarted and privately furious, was humiliated. He had been outmaneuvered not by Fairfax, but by the man's oversized mail-order bride. His rage, denied a legal outlet, began to fester, curdling into something far more dangerous. The wind began 2 nights later. It was a hot, dry gale, a chinook that swept down from the mountains, sucking the moisture from the very air. It rattled the windows of the boarding house and moaned through the eaves. Tessa was jolted from a restless sleep, by a sound that struck terror in the heart of every frontier settler, the frantic, desperate clang of the fire bell. She leaped from her bed, her heart seizing in her chest. Her window was filled with a sickening, dancing orange light. The glow was coming from the north, from the direction of Whisperwind Ridge. Fire. The shout echoed from the street below, followed by a rising clamor of panicked voices. Without a thought for her own safety, Tessa pulled on her dress and boots. Her only thought was of Holden. She flew down the stairs and out into the chaotic street. The air was thick with the smell of smoke, and embers carried on the ferocious wind rained down like fiery insects. "The whole ridge is going up," a man yelled. Ignoring Martha's frantic pleas to stay, Tessa ran to the livery stable, her mind a maelstrom of fear. She saddled the fastest horse, her hands moving with a desperate, practiced speed. She vaulted into the saddle and galloped out of town, a lone figure charging toward a horizon of hellfire. The scene at the camp was an apocalypse. The fire, driven by the relentless wind, was consuming the forest with an explosive, roaring hunger. Entire trees vanished in fountains of flame. Holden and his crew, silhouetted against the inferno, were fighting a battle they could not win. They were trying to widen a firebreak, their axes swinging in a desperate rhythm, their faces black with soot. Tessa found Holden near the creek, his voice raw from shouting commands. His eyes were wild when he saw her, a mixture of terror and disbelief. "Tessa, get out of here. For God's sake, it's not safe. I am not leaving you," she screamed back over the roar. She looked around her mind, assessing the chaos, searching for a way to help. And then she saw them. In a small corral near the creek, Holden's draft horses and mules were trapped, screaming in terror, their eyes white with panic as the flames at Worthingtoned. The horses, she yelled to Holden, "I can get them out." He saw the unshakable resolve in her eyes, the same strength he'd seen on the train platform, the same strength he fell in love with, and knew arguing was futile. He gave her a single desperate nod before turning back to the impossible task of battling the fire. Tessa raced to the corral. She threw open the gate, but the animals were too crazed to move, huddling together against the far fence. Instead of shouting, Tessa began to speak in a low, steady voice, the same calm, reassuring tone she had used on the spooked horse in the alley so long ago. She walked slowly into the pen, a beacon of calm in the swirling chaos. She reached the lead mare, a big Percheron, and took hold of her halter, her touch firm and confident. "Easy now, girl," she crooned, stroking the mare's trembling neck. "It's all right. We're going to walk out of here. Together." Under her steady hand, the mare's panic subsided. She took a hesitant step, and then another. The other animals, sensing the shift, followed her lead. Tessa guided them out of the corral and down a game trail that led away from the fire toward the safety of the lower meadows. As she urged the last mule to safety, she glanced back toward the camp. Her blood ran cold. Silhouetted against the flames near the main supply shed, a shed filled with oil and blasting powder, was a figure. It wasn't one of Holden's men. It was Jedediah Kane. A lit torch was in his hand. He was about to set a new blaze, one that would not only cut off any chance of escape, but would cause an explosion that would level the entire camp. A fury unlike anything she had ever known. Cold, clear, and absolute surged through Tessa. She was not a workhorse to be scorned or an ornament to be admired. She was a woman defending her home and her own. "Kane," she shrieked, her voice ripping through the night. He spun around his face, a demonic mask of shock in the firelight. Caught, he hesitated for only a second before hurling the torch onto the shed's dry roof. It ignited instantly. He turned to flee, but Holden had heard her cry. He had seen it all. With a roar that was more animal than human, he launched himself across the clearing. He hit Kane with the force of a falling tree, and the two men went down in a brutal tangle of limbs. Kane fought with the viciousness of a cornered rat, but he was no match for Holden, whose every blow was fueled by righteous rage. The fight was savage, but brief. Holden hauled Kane to his feet, his powerful hands bunched in the man's shirt. Just then, the town sheriff and a posse, summoned by one of the loggers, thundered into the clearing. They took in the scene at a glance, the newly torched shed, and Holden holding the arsonist. The long night was spent fighting beside the men, digging, hauling water, and beating back the flames. By dawn, the wind had died, and a light rain began to fall. The fire was contained. The ridge was a blackened, steaming scar, but the heart of the forest and the camp itself had been saved. As the sun rose, casting a watery, smoke-filtered light over the devastation, Holden found Tessa. They stood together coated in soot, their bodies aching with exhaustion, their lungs raw. He pulled her into his arms, holding her with a desperate tenderness, burying his face in her smoke-scented hair. "You saved them all," he rasped, his voice thick with emotion. "The horses, the men. You saved me." She leaned her head against his solid, unyielding chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart. "No," she whispered, her voice as weary, but as strong as his. She pulled back just enough to look him in the eyes, her gaze clear and unwavering. "We saved it. Together." He looked at her, then truly looked at her, at the soot on her cheek, the strength in her jaw, the love in her tired eyes. The fire had not been their end. It had been their crucible. It had burned away everything that was not essential, leaving only the pure, unbreakable truth of what they were to each other, not a lumberjack and a mail-order bride, but partners forged into one, ready to build a new world from the ashes. And so, in the ashes of Jedediah Kane's malice, a new future for Holden and Tessa was born. They rebuilt their love as strong and resilient as the old-growth pines that had weathered the flames. They married not in a stuffy church, but under the open sky on Whisperwind Ridge, with Martha Gable as their witness and the loyal loggers as their honored guests. Tessa never became a delicate ornament. Instead, she became the heart of the logging operation, her sharp mind managing the books, and her steady presence a source of strength for all. Their home was not a place of fragile furniture, but a sturdy cabin filled with laughter, respect, and a love that was forged in rejection and tempered by fire. Their story became a legend in Redemption Gulch, a reminder that true worth isn't measured by size or appearance, but by the strength of one's character and the courage to love who you are. If Tessa and Holden's journey from public shame to powerful love moved you, please let us know by giving this video a thumbs up. Their story proves that even in the harshest of worlds, the right person will see your true value. Share this video with someone who appreciates a story of resilience and true love. And for more historical dramas that bring the past to life, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Thank you for watching.